The doctor's visit. Part 1. The first appointment. Claire Matthews glanced at herself in the rearview mirror, quickly adjusting a stray lock of blonde hair. She wasn't one to obsess over her appearance, but today felt different. The appointment she was about to attend had been on her mind for weeks now, ever since she'd first met Dr. David Holden. It was supposed to be just a routine visit, but something about him had left an impression that she couldn't shake. She got out of the car, brushing down her simple navy dress, her usual choice, nothing flashy. At 42, Claire had settled into a life of quiet comfort. She lived in a modest, well-kept home with her husband, Tom. Their life together was steady, predictable. But lately, predictability felt like monotony. The excitement of their early years had dulled into a pattern of familiar gestures, spoken in the same tones. They still loved each other, she was sure of that. But sometimes, Claire wondered if love alone was enough. Pushing open the glass door of the clinic, she was met with the familiar sterile smell of antiseptic. The waiting room was quiet, save for the gentle hum of fluorescent lights. Claire checked in with the receptionist, a young woman whose smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and took a seat. She fiddled with her phone, pretending to scroll through emails while her mind wandered. Her heart beat a little faster than usual. Anticipation, she told herself. Minutes later, the door to the inner office opened, and there he was. Dr. David Holden, a man in his early 50s, walked in with the kind of calm authority that came from years of practice. Tall, with salt and pepper hair and a sharp jawline, he was the kind of man who looked effortlessly in control. His eyes, though warm and professional, had a depth to them, as if they held unspoken secrets. His white coat was crisp, but it couldn't hide the strong frame beneath. When his gaze fell on Claire, she felt a spark, subtle but unmistakable. Claire Matthews? His voice was smooth, and when she stood up to follow him into the exam room, her pulse quickened again. Inside, the room was the epitome of clinical sterility. Medical instruments, bright lights, and pristine surfaces surrounded them, yet Claire felt an underlying current in the air, a heat that contrasted with the coldness of the setting. She tried to dismiss it as nervousness. This was just another appointment, nothing more. "How have you been feeling since your last visit?" Dr. Holden asked, his tone polite, but with a hint of something more personal. He sat down across from her, their knees almost touching, though separated by the small space of the patient's chair. "I've been fine," Claire replied, her voice betraying her slight nervousness. "Nothing major." Dr. Holden's eyes lingered on her just a moment too long, his gaze tracing the curve of her neck, the way her hair fell softly against her collarbone. Claire shifted in her seat, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. He noticed everything about her, in a way that made her feel exposed yet oddly thrilled. He was supposed to be diagnosing her symptoms, yet it felt as though he could see right through her, to the parts she kept hidden, even from herself. "Let's do a quick checkup, just to be sure." His voice was measured, calm, but the air between them felt anything but. He stood up, gesturing for her to follow him to the examination table. Claire's hands felt clammy as she climbed onto the cold surface. The paper crinkled beneath her as she lay back, staring at the ceiling. She tried to focus on the harsh lights above, to distract herself from the sensation of Dr. Holden's hands, steady, professional, yet undeniably warm, gently pressing against her skin as he performed his exam. His touch was brief, clinical, yet each point of contact seemed to leave an impression that lasted long after he moved his hand away. Her breath caught slightly when his fingers brushed against the pulse point on her wrist, lingering a little too long. She knew he had to feel her heart beating faster. "You're in good health," he said after a pause, his voice almost too casual. "But it's always smart to stay on top of these things." Their eyes met, and for a split second, the sterile environment of the doctor's office seemed to fade. It was just the two of them, locked in a moment that neither of them had expected but neither could deny. "I'll see you again in a few weeks for the follow-up," Dr. Holden said, but there was something more in his tone, a suggestion, an invitation. Claire nodded, feeling a strange sense of both relief and loss as the appointment concluded. She gathered her things, trying to steady her breathing, but the feeling lingered as she walked out of the office and into the crisp autumn air. The world outside felt different, as though something had shifted, but only she knew. Driving home, she couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes had lingered on her, the brief yet charged touch of his hand on her skin. It had been just a routine visit, but it felt like something much more. Something dangerous, something thrilling, something that she couldn't tell her husband. Claire glanced down at her phone, seeing the notification for her next appointment pop up. Her finger hovered over the confirm button. She knew she should just cancel it, that nothing good could come from continuing this strange, thrilling dance. But instead, she pressed confirm, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips as she thought about seeing him again. Part 2. The second visit. Claire stood in front of the mirror again, this time taking a little more care than usual. She wore a light, airy blouse and fitted jeans, casual but flattering enough to draw attention without being obvious. She paused for a moment, staring at her reflection. Was this really necessary? It was just another appointment after all. But she knew deep down it wasn't just about the checkup. There was a thrill building inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, something that pulled her back to Dr. Holden's office. Her mind flitted back to the first visit, how his gaze had lingered, how his touch had lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed between them, something neither of them had spoken about, yet both understood. Now, as she headed out the door, she pushed those thoughts to the back of her mind, trying to convince herself that this was all just innocent. The clinic felt quieter than usual when she arrived, as though the world outside had grown distant and muffled. The receptionist barely acknowledged her, too absorbed in paperwork, which suited Claire just fine. The fewer people that noticed her visits, the better. She was led back to the familiar exam room, her nerves fluttering again in anticipation. Moments later, Dr. Holden entered, his presence filling the room. His usual calm, professional demeanor was intact, but there was something in the way he smiled at her, a recognition of what lay unspoken between them. "Claire," he said, his tone as smooth as ever. "Good to see you again." "Good to see you too, Doctor." The formal title felt strange on her tongue, almost a reminder that they were in a space bound by rules, a place where certain lines shouldn't be crossed. The small talk between them was brief, polite, but under the surface, the tension buzzed. She found herself hyper-aware of every movement, every glance, every breath. As he went through the motions of the exam, his hands once again brushed her skin with that same familiar warmth. But this time, it wasn't the fleeting touch of a doctor. It felt deliberate, as if he was testing the boundaries, seeing if she would react. And she did. When his fingers lightly grazed the small of her back, a shiver shot through her, and their eyes met. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and for a moment, the air between them thickened. Her heartbeat quickened, and she knew he could hear it. There was no hiding her reaction now. "Everything looks good," he said, his voice slightly lower than before. He didn't move away from her immediately, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "But you might want to come in for another follow-up, just to be sure." It was an unnecessary suggestion. Claire was perfectly healthy and they both knew it. Yet she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I think that would be a good idea." As they exchanged a few final words and he opened the door for her to leave, she hesitated for just a moment. There was something electric in the air, something unfinished. And then, almost imperceptibly, his hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that could easily be passed off as accidental. But it wasn't. She left the office with her heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Was she reading too much into these small moments? As she drove home, her mind whirled with questions, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Tom had called earlier, asking about her appointment, but she had been vague. There was no need to mention how often she'd been going. No need to stir up questions about routine checkups. As the days passed, Claire's mind drifted back to Dr. Holden more and more. Every notification about an upcoming appointment sent a thrill through her. She found herself looking forward to the visits in a way that felt both exciting and wrong. There was a line she was towing, a boundary that had yet to be crossed, but it felt closer each time. Weeks later, when she arrived for the next appointment, the tension was palpable. The receptionist barely looked at her as she checked in. Claire had become just another regular patient. But when she stepped into the exam room, the sterile environment suddenly felt suffocating, like a mask that was barely holding back what was really happening beneath the surface. Dr. Holden greeted her as usual, but this time there was no mistaking the way his eyes lingered on her. The small talk fell away quickly, and as the examination began, their touches became longer, the silences heavier. His fingers pressed into her skin, but it wasn't the touch of a doctor anymore. This time, when his hand grazed her waist, it stayed, his breath almost imperceptibly deepening as he leaned closer. "Claire," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." Her breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she had been anticipating, yet dreading. They both knew what he meant, but neither was willing to say it outright. The space between them was charged with an unspoken desire, an intensity that was hard to ignore. She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't think we do." The words hung in the air, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then, in one swift motion, his hand moved to the small of her back, pulling her just a little closer. It was subtle enough to seem innocent to anyone who might walk in, but to them, it was everything. Claire's breath hitched, her pulse racing. She wanted to stop it, to pull back before they went too far, but the heat of his touch, the intensity in his eyes, she couldn't resist. In that moment, the clinical walls of the doctor's office seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, caught in the pull of something far beyond a routine checkup. Part 3. The point of no return. Claire's breath came shallow as she left the clinic, her mind swirling with what had just happened. In that final moment of her second visit, Dr. Holden had stepped so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. His hand had lingered, his voice had softened, and they had crossed an unspoken boundary. She had told herself she could stop at any time, that this was all just a harmless flirtation. But the heat between them felt undeniable, and each visit left her wanting more. She barely spoke to Tom when she got home that evening. He had greeted her with his usual warmth, asking how her appointment went, his words filled with genuine concern. Claire had answered briefly, slipping into the kitchen to prepare dinner. Her hands moved mechanically, chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, but her thoughts were far from their quiet suburban kitchen. Tom leaned against the counter, sipping from a glass of water, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. "Another follow-up next week?" he asked. Claire hesitated, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just routine." The words felt hollow in her throat. Tom had no reason to doubt her, and that realization only deepened the guilt gnawing at her. That night, lying beside Tom in bed, Claire's thoughts drifted to Dr. Holden. The contrast between her husband's familiar warmth and the electric pull she felt with the doctor was stark, almost overwhelming. Tom had always been good to her, a steady, reliable partner. But lately, that stability felt more like stagnation, a life lived in slow motion. In Dr. Holden's office, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The days blurred by in a fog of anticipation, and soon it was time for her next appointment. As she pulled into the clinic parking lot, her hands trembled slightly. What was she doing? How had it come to this? Claire had always seen herself as a good wife, a good person, but this wasn't who she was, or was it? The rush she felt walking into the office was undeniable. She craved it, and the craving was stronger than the guilt. Dr. Holden was waiting for her in the exam room, his expression unreadable as she entered. There was a moment of silence between them, the sterile hum of the clinic the only sound. Then, without a word, he closed the door behind her, his movements deliberate, measured. "Claire," he began, his voice low and steady. "We need to be careful." She nodded, her heart racing. She knew exactly what he meant. There were boundaries, rules, both professional and personal, that they were dangerously close to breaking. But in that moment, all she wanted was for him to cross that line. The examination began, as it always did, but this time, the air between them was thick with tension. His hands moved over her body with the precision of a doctor, but there was an intimacy in his touch that sent shivers down her spine. Every point of contact felt electric, and Claire couldn't stop her mind from wandering, imagining what would happen if they let go of the thin veil of professionalism that still lingered between them. And then, it happened. He was checking her pulse, his fingers lingering just a moment too long on her wrist. Their eyes met, and in that instant, all the careful restraint they had both clung to vanished. Before she knew it, his lips were on hers, tentative at first, then more urgent as they gave in to the passion that had been building between them for weeks. Claire's mind screamed at her to stop, but her body had already made the decision. She kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair as he pulled her closer, his touch no longer professional, no longer restrained. The clinical sterile room felt miles away as they moved together, lost in the heat of the moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, reality came crashing back. The room was the same, white walls, bright lights, the smell of antiseptic, but everything else had changed. "We can't," Claire whispered, her voice shaky. "This is wrong." Dr. Holden stepped back, his expression conflicted. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Claire. I haven't been able to since the moment you walked into my office." His confession hung in the air, and Claire felt her heart lurch. She knew she should walk away, leave the office and never look back. But the pull between them was too strong, too intoxicating. She had tasted something she couldn't give up, no matter how wrong it felt. "I need to go," she muttered, grabbing her bag and practically fleeing the office. As she drove home, her mind raced, filled with a chaotic mix of guilt, excitement, and fear. She couldn't keep doing this, but the thought of not seeing Dr. Holden again made her chest tighten. At home, Tom greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside her. They ate dinner together, watching TV in silence afterward. Claire could barely focus on the screen, her mind still replaying the moment in the exam room, the feel of Dr. Holden's lips on hers. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Tom's gentle snoring beside her. The guilt gnawed at her, but the excitement wouldn't let go. It had been years since she had felt this alive, this wanted. But at what cost? The next day, Tom noticed something, a bill from the clinic for her follow-up appointments. He glanced at it curiously, his brow furrowed. "Claire, you've been going to the doctor more than you mentioned," he said, his voice casual but laced with curiosity. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't expected him to notice, hadn't thought that the frequency of her visits would raise any flags. She forced a smile, shrugging. "Just routine checkups. You know how they are, always scheduling follow-ups." But Tom's gaze lingered on her a moment too long, a hint of suspicion creeping into his eyes. "You're sure everything's okay?" "Of course," she said quickly, too quickly. She could feel the tension in the air now, the first crack in the facade. "Everything's fine." But as Tom left the room, the bill still in his hand, Claire knew that things were far from fine. The lie had been so small, so easy to tell. But it was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would be impossible to hide for long. Part 4. Secrets Unraveling. The tension in the house began to shift in subtle ways after that night. Tom hadn't brought up the medical bill again, but Claire could feel a change in the air, a quiet suspicion growing in his eyes whenever their conversations turned to her doctor's appointments. Each time she left for the clinic, his questions were a little more probing, his tone a bit more guarded. And yet, she kept going back. Dr. Holden's office had become something of an escape for her, a place where the predictable world she lived in fell away. The sterile white walls and clinical equipment no longer represented medicine or health. Instead, they stood as symbols of their secret, an illicit world that existed only between the two of them. It wasn't long before the touches became more frequent, more daring. The stolen moments between them in the exam room were like fire, burning hotter each time they met. The thrill of their secret, combined with the forbidden nature of their encounters, only made the passion between them more intoxicating. But the more Claire indulged, the harder it became to hide. One evening, Tom brought it up again. This time, not as a casual question but as a direct confrontation. Claire had been folding laundry in the living room when Tom sat down across from her, the bill for her most recent visit in his hand. His brow was furrowed, concern etched deep into his face. "Claire, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice calm but firm. Her hands paused over the shirt she was folding, her heart sinking. "What is it?" He looked down at the paper, his thumb rubbing the edge thoughtfully. "I found another bill for your follow-up appointment. I don't understand why you didn't mention it." She swallowed hard, trying to keep her expression neutral. "It was just a routine visit," she replied, her voice too steady, too rehearsed. "I didn't think it was important enough to mention." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze steady on hers. "But you've been going more frequently than usual. You said everything was fine, so why all the appointments?" Claire felt her pulse quicken, her palms growing clammy. She had prepared for this moment, telling herself that she could lie, that she could come up with an excuse that would explain away her behavior. But sitting there, under Tom's gaze, she suddenly felt exposed, like a deer caught in headlights. She hesitated, trying to grasp for something, anything that would sound believable. "It's just precautionary. The doctor wanted to make sure everything was okay." The lie felt weak, even as she spoke it, and Tom knew it. "Claire." His voice was soft now, filled with the kind of quiet understanding that only years of marriage could bring. "I know something's going on. I just don't understand why you're hiding it from me." Her heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment she had feared, the moment where the fragile web of lies she had spun would start to unravel. But she couldn't bring herself to admit the truth, not yet. Not when the consequences of that truth would be so devastating. "I'm not hiding anything," she insisted, her voice a little too high, a little too desperate. "There's nothing to worry about, Tom." But Tom didn't look convinced. He set the bill down on the table, his fingers drumming lightly against the surface. "Claire, if something's wrong, if there's something going on with your health, I need to know. I want to be there for you." His words twisted like a knife in her chest. Tom's concern was genuine, his love for her evident in the way he spoke, the way he looked at her. He wasn't accusing her of anything. He was worried, scared that something serious was happening behind his back. And the fact that she was hiding something completely different only deepened her guilt. "I'm fine, Tom," she said softly, lowering her eyes. "I promise." But even as she said it, she knew that promise was a lie. She wasn't fine. Nothing about this situation was fine. She was caught in the middle of something that had spiraled far beyond her control, something that could destroy the life she had built with Tom. After that night, the distance between them grew. Tom didn't press her further about the doctor's visits, but Claire could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. He had always trusted her implicitly, never questioning her choices or her explanations. But now, that trust was cracking, and Claire could feel the weight of it every time they sat together in the same room. She tried to go through the motions of their daily life, cooking, cleaning, laughing at the right moments when Tom made a joke, but everything felt hollow. The thrill she had once felt with Dr. Holden was now tainted by the growing tension at home. And yet, she couldn't stop herself from going back to the clinic, couldn't stop the pull she felt toward him. One afternoon, Claire sat in her car outside the clinic, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. She had been sitting there for nearly 10 minutes, torn between the life she had with Tom and the temptation that waited for her inside. She had told herself that this would be the last time, that after today she would stop. But deep down, she knew that was another lie. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked into the clinic, her heart racing as she approached the exam room. Dr. Holden was waiting for her inside, his expression unreadable as she entered. There was a tension in the air between them. Something unspoken, something heavy. "Claire," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." She felt her stomach twist. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, running a hand through his hair. Whatever this is between us, it can't continue." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known this moment would come, had anticipated it. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Holden stepped closer, his gaze softening as he reached for her hand. "It's not that I don't want this, but we're playing with fire, Claire. Sooner or later it's going to catch up with us." She swallowed hard, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. He was right, of course. They had been playing a dangerous game, and the consequences were inevitable. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to walk away. "I can't keep lying to him," she said, her voice cracking. "He's starting to figure it out." Dr. Holden sighed, his hand tightening around hers. "Then you need to make a choice, before it's too late." Part 5. The Unraveling Truth. The silence that followed Dr. Holden's words seemed to stretch for eternity. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time since it all began, she truly understood the weight of her actions. This wasn't just a fling, a momentary escape from the monotony of her life. It was something that threatened to tear her world apart. She squeezed his hand, her throat tight. "I don't know if I can make that choice," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the sterile confines of the exam room. Dr. Holden stepped closer, his gaze piercing through her, filled with a mix of longing and regret. "You have to," he said softly. "Because if you don't, it's all going to come crashing down. And I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart, Claire." She knew he was right, but the thought of walking away from him left her feeling hollow. The passion they had shared, the fire that had ignited between them, it was intoxicating. But now, that same fire was threatening to consume everything. Claire nodded, pulling her hand away from his, her heart aching as she did so. "I'll stop coming," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I need to fix things at home." Dr. Holden didn't argue. He simply nodded, understanding flashing in his eyes. "I'll miss you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll miss you too," Claire replied, her chest tightening with the weight of the truth. And with that, she turned and left the clinic, the finality of her decision settling over her like a heavy fog. The drive home was a blur. Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess, torn between guilt and the overwhelming sense of loss. She had crossed lines she never thought she would cross, and now she was faced with the consequences. When she walked through the front door of her house, Tom was sitting on the couch, flipping through a stack of mail. He glanced up as she entered, his face softening in a way that only deepened her guilt. "Hey," he said, standing up to greet her. He kissed her on the cheek, his touch warm and familiar. But Claire couldn't meet his eyes. She could feel the weight of her deception hanging between them, and it was suffocating. "Hey," she murmured in return, her voice shaky. She dropped her purse on the table and walked toward the kitchen, trying to distract herself with the mundanity of everyday life. But Tom wasn't going to let it go this time. "Claire," he called after her, his voice steady but firm. "Can we talk for a minute?" She froze, her hand hovering over the refrigerator door. Her stomach twisted into knots, and she knew this was it. This was the moment everything would come undone. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it?" Tom held up a piece of paper. A new medical bill. This one for a follow-up appointment she had never mentioned. His expression was calm, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, something that made her chest tighten with fear. "You told me everything was fine," he said quietly, his voice measured. "So why do you keep going back to the doctor?" Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her mind raced, searching for an excuse, a plausible reason, but the weight of her lies had finally caught up with her. Tom took a step closer, his gaze steady. "I don't understand why you'd hide something so simple, Claire," he said, his voice filled with a quiet confusion. "If it's just a routine checkup, why not tell me?" Her throat tightened, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to tell him the truth, to come clean and confess everything. But the words wouldn't come. She had dug herself into a hole so deep that there was no easy way out. Her voice faltered, the guilt overwhelming her. "It's nothing, Tom. I just didn't want to worry you." But even as she said it, she could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. "Claire," he said, his tone softer now, more pleading. "I know something's not right. Please just tell me what's going on." The dam inside her broke. The lies, the guilt, the secret affair. It all came crashing down on her. She couldn't keep hiding anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when her world was teetering on the edge of collapse. But before she could say anything, Tom's expression shifted, as if a realization was beginning to dawn on him. His eyes narrowed slightly, his brow furrowing as he studied her face. "Is there something going on between you and the doctor?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire's breath caught in her throat, and in that moment she knew she had been caught. She could see the pieces falling into place in Tom's mind, the frequent visits, the evasive answers, the way she had been acting distant. He was starting to understand, and the realization was hitting him like a slow-moving train. She opened her mouth to deny it, to lie one more time. But the look in his eyes, the hurt, the betrayal, the pain, stopped her cold. "Tom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Tom's face went pale, his eyes searching hers for any sign that what he was thinking wasn't true. But he found none. The truth was written all over her face. Tom took a step back, his hands falling to his sides. His voice was hollow when he spoke. "How long?" Claire felt her knees weaken, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It just happened. I'm so sorry, Tom." He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, staring at her as if he didn't recognize the woman in front of him anymore. Finally, he shook his head, his voice barely audible. "I trusted you." The words cut through her like a knife, and Claire felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. She had betrayed the man who had always been there for her, who had loved her unconditionally. And now, she was watching him break because of her. Tom turned and walked toward the door, his movements slow, as if in a daze. "I need some time," he muttered, his voice distant. "Tom, please," Claire started, but he raised a hand to stop her, his back still to her. "I just need some time," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. And with that, he walked out of the house, leaving Claire standing alone in the silence, the weight of her choices crashing down around her. What would you do if your partner had secret appointments for something other than medical reasons? Share your thoughts on how the story should end.